There is a building on Main Street in Charles City, Iowa, where the upper floor windows are boarded and the brick is the color of an old bruise. Across the street, a historical marker, small, easy to miss if you're driving through at 35 miles an hour on your way to somewhere else, notes that the word tractor was born inside a factory that once stood 3 blocks from where you're standing. The company that coined that word does not exist anymore. It hasn't existed, not really, not under its own name, since 1929. The green paint that once rolled out of these doors and into the cornfields of Floyd County is gone from the landscape. The word is not. Every farmer in America who has ever said, "I'm going to go start the tractor," is, without knowing it, quoting an advertising man from Charles City, Iowa, who needed a shorter word for gasoline traction engine and didn't have all day to find one. This is the story of Hart Parr. They didn't just build a machine, they named it. And then the industry they founded buried them under their own word. Every brand on the prairie had a color a neighbor could spot from the road. Alice Chalmers had Persian orange. International Harvester had Farmall red. Hart Parr's color was a deep, almost forest green, trimmed in red, and later in the company's life, a brighter apple green that farmers in Iowa simply called Hart Parr green. Not because it had a fancy paint catalog name, but because there was nothing else it could be confused with. When that green started disappearing from machine sheds across the Corn Belt in the late 1920s, it didn't vanish all at once. It got absorbed, repainted, rebadged, folded into a color history that most people today associate with a different name entirely: Oliver. Charles Hart and Charles Parr met as engineering students at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the 1890s, and in 1897, while still in their early 20s, they founded the Hart Parr Company in Madison to build stationary gasoline engines. They were good at it. Farmers needed power for threshing machines, for sawmills, for anything that used to require a team of horses standing in place all day. But Hart and Parr weren't content with stationary power. They wanted an engine that could pull itself, and a plow, and a wagon, across open ground. In 1900, the company moved its operations to Charles City, Iowa, a small town on the Cedar River that offered land, rail access, and a town council eager enough for industry that they helped finance the move. By 1902, Hart Parr had built what is widely credited as the first commercially successful gasoline traction engine in the United States, a machine so large and heavy that it required 2 men just to start it and was nicknamed Old Reliable by the crews that ran it. It worked. It kept working. And it kept selling. The innovation that put Hart Parr on the map wasn't elegance. Their early machines were crude, loud, and built like locomotives that had wandered off the rails into a wheat field. The 1902 machine alone weighed several tons, and starting it was a 2-man job involving a blowtorch to preheat the ignition system before the crank would even turn. But it ran, day after day, in conditions that destroyed steam engines and exhausted horse teams. Steam traction engines required a dedicated fireman, a constant supply of water and fuel, and the very real danger of a boiler explosion if a crew got careless. A gasoline tractor needed none of that. Farmers in Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas didn't need pretty. They needed something that would still be running at 4 in the afternoon after starting at 5 in the morning, without a boiler to feed or a fireman to pay. Hart Parr gave them that. And by 1907, the company was the largest manufacturer of gasoline traction engines in the world, a title earned almost entirely on the strength of reliability rather than refinement. The Charles City plant itself became something of a pilgrimage site for farm machinery dealers from across the Midwest, who would travel by rail specifically to watch the big green machines being tested on a stretch of ground behind the factory before they were crated and shipped. Local boys from town took jobs sweeping the foundry floor specifically because it was the most exciting workplace in Floyd County, louder than the grain elevator, busier than the rail depot, and clearly, even to a 12-year-old in 1908, building something that mattered to every farm for 50 miles in any direction. And then, in 1906, the company did something that would outlive every tractor it ever built. Hart Parr's advertising manager, a man named W.H. Williams, was tasked with writing copy for the company's gasoline traction engines, and he found the existing terminology, gasoline traction engine, too clumsy for a headline. He combined traction and motor into a new word, tractor. It first appeared in Hart Parr's promotional literature that year, describing their Model 3060. The word caught on faster than the machines did. By the 1910s, tractor had become the generic term for the entire category, used by competitors who had never paid Hart Parr a dime for it, and eventually by farmers who had no idea where the word had come from at all. What happened to the company that gave the industry its name is the part of this story that almost nobody outside Floyd County remembers. And it began not with a competitor's better machine, but with Hart Parr's own refusal to change. If there is one machine that represents Hart Parr at its peak, agricultural historians and collectors generally point to the Hart Parr 1836, produced through the early 1920s, and its successor, the Hart Parr 1224 Little Devil, which arrived in 1918 as the company's belated answer to the lightweight tractor revolution that Ford's Fordson had just unleashed on the market. The 1836 carried roughly 36 horsepower at the belt and was priced new at around $1,750, a substantial sum for a working farm in the late 1910s, equivalent to a serious chunk of a season's income for a mid-sized corn belt operation. Restored examples today change hands at antique tractor auctions in the range of $8,000 to $15,000, depending on condition, with rare early old reliable type machines from before 1910 fetching considerably more when they surface at all. Farm publications of the era, including pieces later compiled in oral history collections at the Floyd County Historical Society, describe Hart Parr machines as slow, heavy, and nearly indestructible, the kind of tractor a farmer's father had run, and that the farmer himself, 20 years later, was still running, because it simply hadn't worn out. That reputation was Hart Parr's great strength, and eventually, its great liability. The company had built its identity on weight and durability at exactly the moment the rest of the industry, led by Henry Ford's Fordson and soon by International Harvester's Farmall, was racing toward lighter, cheaper, faster machines that ordinary farmers could afford and operate without a dedicated engineer on staff. For a stretch of years in the early 1920s, the green paint of Hart Parr was still a common sight on Iowa farms, a mark of an older kind of loyalty, the farmer who trusted weight and simplicity over speed and price. An oral history collected by the Floyd County Historical Society quotes a Floyd County farmer recalling that his father refused to trade in the family's Hart Parr, even after neighbors had moved on to lighter Fordsons and Farmalls, on the grounds that the Hart Parr had never once left him stranded in a field, and that counted for more than a few extra dollars an acre in fuel. That kind of testimony repeats itself across the surviving record. Not enthusiasm for innovation, but a kind of stubborn, earned trust. The trust a farmer extends to a machine that has simply never failed him. But the gap between what Hart Parr offered and what the market wanted was widening every season, and the company that had named an entire industry was falling behind inside it. Where International Harvester was redesigning its Farmall line around the idea of a single small tractor that could do row crop work a horse team used to do, and Ford was selling the Fordson at a price point built for volume rather than margin, Hart Parr kept building machines in the old idiom. Heavier, more expensive, engineered for threshing and heavy belt work rather than the nimble row crop cultivation that was quickly becoming the industry's real battleground. The Little Devil was Hart Parr's attempt to compete on weight and price, but it arrived years after Fordson had already claimed that ground, and it never sold in the numbers the company needed. There is a record in agricultural trade journals of the period showing just how fast that gap widened, and the number that should have been a warning to Hart Parr's board arrived years before anyone in Charles City was willing to act on it. The pressure on Hart Parr did not arrive as a single crisis. It arrived as a slow financial bleed through most of the 1920s, well before the farm crisis that would devastate the rest of the industry in the 1980s. Agricultural land values and commodity prices had spiked during the First World War and then collapsed sharply starting in 1920-21, when European agriculture came back online and grain prices fell by roughly half in some markets within a year. American farmers, many of whom had taken on debt to expand during the wartime boom, spent the entire decade that followed working through that debt under depressed prices, a full 10 years before the stock market crash that most people associate with farm hardship. Hart Parr, selling into that shrinking, debt-burdened market with machines priced for an earlier era of farm prosperity, watched its order books thin out season after season, even as competitors like International Harvester and the newly aggressive Fordson undercut them on price.
By the mid-1920s, Hart Parr's leadership understood the company could not survive alone. Heavy, well-built, slow-to-modernize machinery, and a customer base that could no longer afford it is not a combination that fixes itself. In 1929, Hart Parr merged with three other companies: the Oliver Chilled Plow Works of South Bend, Indiana, the American Seeding Machine Company, and Nichols and Shepard, to form the Oliver Farm Equipment Company. On paper, it was a merger of equals. In practice, it was the end of Hart Parr as an independent name. The Hart Parr badge disappeared from new machines almost immediately. The green gave way, eventually, to Oliver's own Meadow Green, a different shade entirely, applied to tractors that no longer carried the Hart Parr name at all.
The last tractor to roll off the line in Charles City under the Hart Parr name did so sometime in 1930, as the badge was phased out in favor of the new Oliver identity. There is no surviving record of a formal ceremony, no last tractor photograph treasured by the company, the way some brands preserve their final machines. The man who oversaw the transition later told a local reporter that nobody in the plant that week thought of it as an ending. They thought of it as a merger. It took decades and the slow erasure of the name from public memory for it to look like anything else.
Charles City, Iowa did not disappear when Hart Parr did. The plant on the east side of town kept running, first as Oliver, later after Oliver's own absorption into the White Motor Corporation in the 1960s, and eventually as part of White's broader farm equipment consolidation. Production at the Charles City facility continued in some form for decades after the Hart Parr name itself had vanished from the sheet metal. But the town's identity as the birthplace of the tractor slowly detached from any single living company. Charles City's population, which sat around 8,000 in the years Hart Parr was at its strongest, has held roughly steady to slightly declined over the following century. A small Iowa town that never collapsed outright the way some single industry factory towns did, but that also never grew into anything larger, its fortunes tied for decades to a name on a building that kept changing owners.
Today, the Hart Parr legacy in Charles City survives mostly in monuments rather than machinery. A historical marker downtown, the Hart Parr name preserved by the Floyd County Historical Society, and the Hart Parr 1900 Stockyards Antique Power Show, a community-run event in nearby Charles City that draws tractor enthusiasts every September, specifically to honor the company's role in inventing the word that every farmer in the country uses without thinking about it. Somewhere in a machine shed in northern Iowa tonight, a restored Hart Parr, maybe an 1836, maybe one of the rarer early old reliable types, is getting its magneto checked before the next antique power show. The people who keep these machines running are not nostalgic in a vague way. They are specific. They know the model numbers. They know which engines used which carburetor. They know that the word they use every single day of their working lives, tractor, came out of an advertising office on Main Street in a town most of them have actually driven through. The Hart Parr collectors and the broader antique tractor and implement community treat the brand not as a curiosity, but as an origin point, the way a baseball fan might treat the diamond where the first official rules were written down.
That is the strange shape of Hart Parr's disappearance. The company didn't vanish the way Alice Chalmers or Minneapolis Moline vanished, swallowed whole by farm crisis and corporate buyout in a single dramatic decade. Hart Parr dissolved earlier and more quietly than that, absorbed into Oliver before the worst of the Depression even arrived, its name erased from new iron, while the word it had invented kept multiplying across every farm in the country,
attached to machines built by the very competitors who had outpriced it. The men who named the tractor did not get to keep the company that built it. That is the real shape of this loss, not a factory closing, not a brand badge disappearing from a hood. A name being replaced by its own invention, used 1,000,000 times a day by people who never once think to ask where the word came from, on machines that owe their existence to 2 engineering students from Madison, Wisconsin, who just wanted a shorter way to say what they'd built.
If you've ever called it a tractor, and of course you have, everyone has, you've been saying Charles Hart and Charles Parr's word since before your grandfather was born. If that means anything to you, the next story is one you'll want to hear.